Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name's Ben White. I'm one of the directors of the Health Law Research Centre, and Lindy Wilmot, my colleague, the other director of the Health Law Research Centre. We're delighted to welcome you to the inaugural Health Law Research Centre Annual Public Lecture. We're delighted to be starting this lecture series, and I might perhaps just tell you a little bit about how we came to do this. From humble beginnings, probably about a decade ago, that the breadth and depth of health law research at QUT has grown, and we now have the largest cohort of health law academics in the country. We've got 15, an active body of health law high degree research students, and a team of research staff, all working in the field of health law that we obviously are all interested in to come along tonight. Our centre covers the full spectrum from the beginning of life, children's health and welfare, through to the end of life, and indeed regulation and governance of everything that happens in between. And at the heart of the Centre's mission is the idea of making a difference, to do research that brings about a change to make things better. And to do that, we do things like engaging with how health law and regulation can make healthcare in Australia and internationally safer, of a higher quality and more accessible. And to seek to make that happen, it's not just about doing research tucked away in our offices, it's about getting out and participating in public and policy debates. And this lecture forms part of that goal. To hold an annual lecture which is open to the public on a significant health law issue delivered by an internationally recognised expert. So welcome to the first and foundational Health Law Research Centre Annual Public Lecture. And given that it is the first, it's very appropriate that we have Professor Loane Skene to deliver it, who was the first health lawyer of this country, the pioneer of Australian health law. Loane is a professor at the Melbourne Law School and an adjunct professor in the Department of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences at the University of Melbourne, and she has had an extraordinarily distinguished career. She's currently a member of the Australian Health Ethics Committee and has served on numerous state and federal bodies that look at a range of issues, but particularly in the field of law and genetics. So in 2005, she was Deputy Chair of the Lockhart Committee on Human Cloning and Embryo Research, and was a member of the HERE committee that reviewed the federal legislation on that topic. Professor Skene has published extensively in the field of health law, as we all know. Many of us have used her books, her articles, and across that spectrum that I mentioned before. She was awarded the Centenary Medal by the Commonwealth for service to Australian society through exploration of legal and ethical issues in relation to healthcare, and has been appointed a Fellow of Queen's College Melbourne and a Plumer Fellow at St Anne's College, Oxford. On a personal note, Lindy and I also wanted to mention that Loane was recently inducted in as the first and currently only life member of the peak association in the field, the Australasian Association of Bioethics and Health Law. And this is recognition not only of her contribution to the field of scholarship and her participation in the public debate and shaping how we think about health law, but also noted was her contribution to nurturing the next generation of health law academics. Lindy and I have certainly benefited from this, and I know there's a number of people in our centre who have also benefited from Loane's generosity. So it is with great pleasure that I invite her to come forward and ask for us the question, should women be paid for donating their eggs to medical research?
Well, thank you very much, Ben and Lindy and John. And I'm very pleased to be here to give this inaugural lecture. It's a great honour. I've admired the work of the Centre over some time, particularly the publications and the research that have been undertaken there, and I'm very honoured that they've invited me to give this lecture. Now, thinking about this issue, I'm going to put forward a number of arguments that women should be paid for going through the process of donating their eggs for research. And I'm going to limit the comments tonight to donations for research rather than donating eggs to another woman in order to have children, which I think raises slightly different issues. So I'm going to talk about the science and the scientific reasons why eggs may be needed for research. And then I'll look at the arguments for paying women for giving their eggs for research, taking account of counter-arguments and then responses to the counter-arguments. And then I will invite you to comment and put your own thoughts that you can either say what you think or you can question what I've said to you. And if you feel that there is something that you would like to say during the course of the lecture, feel free to butt in and say that as well. So I'll start with the current law. And under the current law, sorry, I can't see my own slides. There is federal legislation and state legislation. In the federal legislation, you have the Prohibition of Human Cloning for Reproduction Act, which goes back to 2002 but was later amended. And it makes it an offence to receive valuable consideration or to give valuable consideration for the use of eggs. So gametes is a term that includes sperm and eggs. So I won't be talking about sperm tonight, but when you see gametes tonight, we'll be talking about eggs. And the other major piece of guidance for people in this area are guidelines that have been published by the National Health and Medical Research Council. And these are called the ART guidelines, Assisted Reproductive Technology Guidelines. And you can see that they also say that there should be no payment or other inducement for giving gametes. So in Australia at the moment, there are strong statements, both in the legislation and in the guidelines, that payment is prohibited. So let's think of some arguments. Oh, I should say that those views were also endorsed when the legislation has been reviewed twice, first by the Lockhart Committee and then by the Heery Committee. And as you heard from Ben, I was a member of both of those committees. So they looked at this prohibition of any payment and they said that at the moment in Australia, despite many submissions to the contrary, the ban on payment should remain. So what are the arguments in favour? And the main argument I want to make to you is that donated eggs are necessary for medical research. And I'll put a number of uses that can be made of eggs in research. And then I'll show you some of the arguments that people have made saying that you don't need to get donated eggs or any eggs for research, and I'll counter those arguments. So these are the main points that I'll be making, that the research can be done on the eggs themselves or an egg in the process of fertilisation, to derive tissue-matched tissue, which could be used for research but particularly for treatment one day, to create embryonic stem cell lines and research on mitochondria, a mitochondrial disease. So let's look at those in turn. So the first one is the treatment for fertility. Everybody thinks that research on eggs is going to be done for stem cell research, but in fact there are more eggs being used in fertility research to help people who have problems with fertility than there are in other types of research. And infertility is a big problem in Australia. So here is a calculation from Queensland of the number of people who are infertile, one couple in 6. So it's a huge issue, and if we're going to improve the procedures, we need to do research. And one of the things that we need this research for is to look at why eggs don't fertilise, and what goes wrong in the process of fertilisation. And so we obviously are going to need eggs for that type of research. Similarly, fetal abnormality. So when a baby is born impaired, parents commonly ask these sorts of questions. What's wrong with my baby? Why did it happen? Are we going to be able to do anything about it to stop it happening again? And one reason why we need to use eggs in research is to do research to investigate what goes wrong when a baby is born with growth impairment. And then we can use eggs in basic research in creating cultures of cells, all of which have a particular mutation. And it would be very difficult to create such a culture in any other way other than by creating it specifically for research using donated eggs. Embryonic stem cell research. In Australia, you're not allowed to create an embryo by fertilising an egg with sperm, but you are allowed to create an embryo by somatic cell nuclear transfer. So you're all familiar with this sort of procedure. You would take a skin cell from my arm, say, and you would take the nucleus out of that. You get a donated egg, remove its nucleus, put the nucleus from my cell into that enucleated egg and stimulate it to develop. And if that happened, the new embryo would have almost entirely my DNA. And the only DNA that would have not come from me would be from the mitochondria in the cytoplasm of the egg. So if I had a mutation like Huntington disease, it would be possible to do this and have the cell culture that has all the cells with that mutation for study. And one day it may be possible with these cells that have tissue matched to me to develop some sort of treatment that you would be able to treat my condition with. One of the points that people often make is that you don't need to do embryonic stem cell research. They've moved past that. Nobody's doing this sort of research anymore. Now, I don't think this is true. I've got a number of slides, including some that I've just done a search on for the last 3 months, looking at what type of research is being done and just looking, first of all, at the ones that identify themselves as embryonic, and then secondly, where embryonic material is used to develop other cells. So I'll show you that slide in a minute. But I think that this research is certainly still continuing to be done. And so I've got a couple of slides just to remind you of the importance of this type of research. So this one is for eye disease. And this trial has now been abandoned for apparently commercial reasons, and they're not going to pursue the trial on spinal tissue. But this was another trial that was using embryonic cells for the purposes of their research. And I've already mentioned this one. Now, one of the new developing areas, not in Australia because you're not allowed to do this in Australia at the moment, but in the UK this is lawful and this type of research is starting to be done. So when the egg is formed, obviously the egg and the sperm combine, and if the woman has a mitochondrial disease, the mitochondria are in the cytoplasm of the egg. So if you imagine an egg looking like a boiled egg, and you've got a poached egg, and you've got the white around the yolk. The yolk could be thought of as the nucleus and the white of the cytoplasm. And so in this cytoplasm you have the mitochondria. And those mitochondria can be passed on when the egg is fertilised, and that mitochondrial disease is then passed on to the child. So what you can see in this slide is a method of trying to treat this. Now, people call this the three-parent embryo because they take the woman's egg and the man's sperm, and then they get an egg from a donor. So that's why it's called the three-parent embryo. And cytoplasm that is normal can be used in addition to any cytoplasm that comes from the woman by going through this process with an enucleated egg and which from a donor, and putting the woman's nucleus into that enucleated egg, which then develops, and it has the healthy cytoplasm from the donor. So this is just starting to be done in England. It's not being used clinically at the moment, but it is lawful. And obviously if it works, there may be more suggestions that this should be done here. Now, looking at the progress so far with stem cells, people think that it's been very slow. But in fact, when you think of all types of research, it takes a long time to do the basic science and then to test it and see if it works, and then go through the process with the Therapeutic Goods Administration to see if it's safe, and then to go through the different stages of phase 2 and 3 trials before it can be put onto the market. So this is necessarily a very, very slow process. And although people think that the progress is slow, in fact a lot has happened already. So we've had embryonic stem cells and induced pluripotent stem cells, I'll talk more about those in a minute, derived, and both of those have been differentiated into other types of cells. So a pluripotent cell is one that can be transformed into a cell of any kind. And in order to do that, you have to take your pluripotent stem cell and then differentiate it so that it becomes a blood cell or a nerve cell, for example. So that has been achieved. And we're starting to get some treatments in humans from embryonic stem cell research. And in animals we're getting it. I've showed you the clinical trials for the humans. And we're getting other types of stem cell treatments in humans. And one day it is said that these stem cell treatments, both embryonic and induced pluripotent stem cell treatment and other types of stem cell treatment, will be able to use, you don't have to read this of course, it just shows you that the claims are that it will be able to be treated to treat diseases of all different parts of the body. So my first point is that embryonic stem cell research and other types of research that are going to require eggs, including for fertility treatment and including for looking at birth defects, we're going to need to do this type of research. And if we do, we're going to need a lot of eggs. It's very difficult to fertilise and form an embryo by this novel technology. And this is evident from what happened with Dolly the sheep. So you can see the large number of eggs that had to be used to just create that one embryo. Now obviously as we have more knowledge and experience, there will be fewer eggs that will be needed. But there are going to be a lot of eggs if we're going to do this type of research. And if we're going to try and encourage women to donate their eggs, I think we're going to need some sort of inducement. So here is the appropriately named Dr. Egan in the United States, who has advertised for donors, and he found that although people would ring up and say that they wanted to help to be involved in this type of research, when they understood what it actually involved in the terms of time and pain and uncertainty in the risks, that women would not donate their eggs. So I think, first of all, I'd like you to think about two groups of women who may be potential donors. And the ones that you think of immediately are the ones that are on fertility treatment. So those women are already taking the drugs to stimulate their ovaries and have the eggs collected for the purposes of fertility treatment. So there's that group. And you might think, well, why can't they just donate a few of their eggs for research, whether you think they should be paid or not? But that's one group. And then there are women that aren't on a fertility treatment. And so with that latter group, should they be paid? And I think you could perhaps make a stronger case at first glance that they should be paid because they're taking on all of these risks and going through all this solely for the purpose of producing eggs and donating the eggs for research. And I think when you see these women who are not on fertility treatment and the procedures that they have to go through in order to collect the eggs, you can see what's actually involved. So these are just ordinary members of the community, perhaps with somebody who is suffering a genetic condition in the family, and they think that they would like to help. So this normal, healthy woman will take drugs to stimulate her ovaries over several weeks, and this will cause pain, may cause pain and mood swings and upset the time that she's at work and just be generally unpleasant. We don't know the long-term risks of this procedure to stimulate the ovaries to produce the eggs. And then the eggs have to be collected through a surgical procedure with all of the risks and unpleasantness associated with that. So it seems reasonable that this woman should be paid for undergoing that procedure. But I think it's also reasonable to compensate women who are already on infertility treatment. So you might say, well, the woman's getting all these eggs. She's not going to need all those eggs. She just needs 1, 2 or 3, to have the babies. And what's going to happen to the rest of them? Why shouldn't she donate them to research? There's been some very interesting empirical work on this. I guess that, when I first thought of it, I probably thought that here are all these spare eggs and these women are going through the procedure, so they might as well just give the eggs for research. But talking to the women who were going through the procedure, particularly in the first cycle, they didn't really know how they were going to feel about their embryos. And when they actually got into, we could step back a little bit further and think how they got onto the infertility treatment program in the first place. So these will be people who have been trying for a long time to have a baby. And the reason why they're on the infertility treatment is because they haven't been able to conceive in the ordinary way. So already the clock is ticking against them. They've got into the IVF program. They've gone through the superovulation to get the eggs. They get the eggs, and then they find that they have a particular feeling about the eggs. And if they have one of the embryos inserted and that forms a baby, well, that's terrific. But if it doesn't, they want to keep the other eggs in reserve. They become particularly precious to them. And they're so keen to have a baby that obviously when they start off, they'll think they'll do anything to have a baby, and part of that may be that they will give their eggs away. But this increasing preciousness of them, particularly in the first cycle where they don't know how they're going to feel, is a real issue. Now, one other point that hasn't been made in this debate is, what if the eggs are unusable? So all of the laws and guidelines we have apply to eggs that are unusable clinically because they haven't matured or it's not possible to fertilise them or something like that. In fact, experience to date shows that where there has been a licence granted for the purpose of embryo research, all of the eggs to date have been unusable. And the unusable eggs, of course, are discarded routinely. So I think that with this, you might say, well, these eggs are not going to have the same preciousness to the woman in particular, but to the couple generally. And so there may be different arguments that could be mounted with regard to unusable eggs. Now, my next point is what happens in other countries. And it's starting to happen that payment is being made in some other countries, particularly the UK, and also in some parts of America. So this one about the excellent price for eggs is New York State, which was the first place where public funds were allowed to be used for the purpose of paying women for donating their eggs. Recently in the UK, there's been an egg bank established where women can donate surplus eggs for research, and there is a policy that the women can be paid up to £750 for this donation. Right, now let's look at some of that's sort of setting the scene. Now let's look at some of the arguments against payment and responses that you might make to those arguments. So the first one, I've tried to persuade you that donated eggs are going to be used for research and we're going to need them. But some people say, no, that's not right. We don't need donated eggs for research. That there are lots of other types of material that could be used in research, and so eggs aren't needed. Well, it's true that not all research requires donated eggs. And so far, a lot of success has been made with adult stem cells. So they can take cells like the olfactory cells in your nose, for example, and those are stem cells. We've got lots of stem cells in our bodies. The treatment for leukemia uses stem cells. So it is true that there is lots of research and lots of treatments that have actually been developed from adult stem cells. But adult stem cells are not pluripotent. They can only be made to replicate into the sort of cells that they are already. And so although that research is very exciting, and there is some scope for reprogramming cells so that they can be changed into different cells, but they're only slightly different. They're not pluripotent in the same way that embryonic stem cells are. And then people say, well, why don't they just use donated embryos from IVF? So if you're in IVF and you've got surplus embryos, you have a number of choices. You can use them yourself or freeze them for later use. You can donate them to another couple. You can have them removed from storage so they just die, or you can donate them for research. So those choices are available, and there are a large number of frozen embryos that can be used in research. But those embryos are made from the gametes, the sperm and ova, from the couple whose embryos they are. And they're not tissue matched to a particular person, and they don't produce a cell culture in which every cell in the culture has the mutation that you want to study in your research. So in future, if it was possible to treat people with stem cells, you'd want stem cells that are matched to the person, which you can get from embryonic stem cells. And then there are induced pluripotent stem cells. Now, just looking at those in turn and showing you what can be done, as I said, the adult stem cells that are already in the body do seem to be ideal for treatment. And there has been some very exciting research. So this is an illustration and a terrific graphic where somebody with macular degeneration in one eye was treated with stem cells that were taken from the other eye. And those were the patient's own adult stem cells, multiplied up in a culture, put onto a contact lens, which the patient wore for 3 weeks, and the patient regained some sight in the eye. So this is an illustration of how adult stem cells can work, and it's certainly very exciting. And scientists see a lot of potential benefits from this. One area in particular is using adult stem cells to repopulate a plastic skeleton of a body part that is injured, in this case trachea, with the cells, putting that structure back into the patient, and the cells are the patient's own cells, and so the patient's got a new organ. So there's a lot of research of that kind, and I'm not saying that this isn't a terrific thing to be doing, but I am saying that this isn't the answer to everything. So some people say that, sorry, I've made that point. Now I want to also speak about induced pluripotent stem cells. Now, when they were first discovered, this was considered to be a huge breakthrough because they said you could get pluripotent stem cells, as induced pluripotent stem cells are from the name, without using an embryo. And so this was the basic procedure. You take your cell, you expose it to elements like proteins that have come from somewhere else, you stimulate it to develop, and it produces something that is like an embryo. And the cells that come from this are pluripotent, so they can be made into any type of cell that might be used in the body. So it seemed very exciting and encouraging. However, when we compare it with embryonic stem cells, it appears that the potential of the induced pluripotent stem cells is not as good. And one main reason is that the cells used to create the induced pluripotent stem cells, coming from a different part of the body, seem to retain some sort of memory of where they came from. They call this epigenetic memory. And so if you've got this cell from a skin cell, for example, and you've been through this process to get the embryos from it, those embryos, the embryonic stem cells from that embryo, revert to the type of cell that they were before. So although in theory they're pluripotent, in practice it looks at the moment as if they don't have the same potential as embryonic stem cells, for which of course we need embryos. Now I said I'd show you a slide, this is just so that you can see very quickly. This is the last 3 months, and this publication publishes what they think is the most exciting research on their website. And so you can see that there are quite a few of these experiments that are being done in America using embryonic stem cells, and in the last one, although they're heart precursor cells, they were derived from embryonic stem cells. So I didn't look at every study. I picked out the ones that had embryonic in their title, and then I just looked at a couple of others because I knew that those were likely to have come from embryonic stem cells. And I made this one, sorry, I made that point. So there are lots of frozen embryos, but these ones are not formed to match a particular person. Now, I want to now think of a few ethical arguments. And one of the arguments against it, of paying women to donate their eggs, is this is commodification, that it turns human bodily material into a commodity. And you're paying them for donating their eggs, and that is ethically wrong. And I think that there are, this slide, I have this because it's such a great picture. This was about buying eggs for treatment from America, which you are now allowed to do, but it's a good slide. But when the women are donating their eggs, they will not be donating, they will not be paid actually for the eggs. You won't get more money if you get more eggs. And you'll get paid even if the eggs are not produced or they're no good. What you're being paid for is going through the process of hyperovulation and the risks and things associated with that, and collecting the eggs for use. And if you go through that procedure, whether you're already on the fertility treatment program or whether you're a member of the public, if you go through that procedure, you're being paid for that, compensated for that, and not for selling the eggs. Then people say, well, if you pay women, you're exploiting vulnerable women, that these people can't really make a choice, particularly the ones on fertility treatment. They're so keen to have a baby that they'll do anything to get onto the program. I think, though, that this really underestimates the intelligence of the women. And certainly in England, they've been saying that these are women who wouldn't otherwise be able to get onto the program because it gives them more money, or it gives them access to treatment at a cheaper price, or it gives them earlier access to treatment, which they couldn't otherwise have. In Australia, these arguments don't apply quite so cogently, because in Australia IVF is not as expensive as it is in England, and there's more state support for it. But it's still an issue that women may be influenced by the fact that they're going to be compensated if they donate some eggs. If you think that women can make appropriate decisions on the basis of proper information and don't necessarily feel that compelled to go on with it, then I think that you can say these women are not being exploited. So you can think what your own response is to that. Then one of the arguments is that if we pay women for eggs, that creates a precedent for payment for blood and organs and things like that. Now, I think those can be distinguished. Donating blood is not a dangerous risky procedure. It's something that's quite simple. And with organs, you're not allowed to donate an organ for use in research. So that's prohibited by the human tissue legislation. So I think that is a different situation. And then these are just the last few sort of comments that people sometimes make, that women have mothering attitudes to eggs and they don't want them used in research. And if they agree to donate their eggs in research, it's only because there's improper pressure applied. If they have to be paid, they don't really want to do it. The proper incentive should be altruism. It's ethically wrong to ask them, and commodification discounts from the altruism of other types of donation. I'm not going to go through all those, it's just to give you some ideas of other arguments that have been put against it. In future, I think that there may be a lot of developments in embryo research. I've shown you all the sorts of research that eggs may be needed for, in addition to embryonic stem cell research. I think we're going to need more eggs, and women won't donate if they're in enough numbers, if they're not offered some sort of inducement. And I hope I've persuaded you that paying in this way is different from paying for the eggs themselves. So nobody had a chance to say anything, but you have your opportunity now.
Thanks, folks. My name's Lindy Wilmot. So we've got maybe 15 minutes to take questions. We've got 2 roving mics, so could you just let us know if you've got a question or comment? Thanks, Pip.
Thanks, Sloane. Claire Boothroyd. That was a brilliant expose of a very difficult topic. There's one thing that is perhaps a vision for the future, and vitrification of eggs has allowed women who have, say, cancer or medical illness to store eggs. And the pregnancy rates are not very good, but they are better than they were with the slow frozen eggs. But many of these women will actually go on to have spontaneous pregnancies and not need these eggs. So in fact, we may have a surplus bank of eggs that have been cryopreserved that may in fact bypass this whole ethical requirement. Have you thought about that in this?
Yes, thank you for raising that. Yes, it is true that if the eggs could be frozen, I mean, we can freeze embryos, and we've been able to do that for a long time. The technology for freezing eggs is developing slowly, and there are still issues with the actual process. But if it were possible to freeze the eggs, it would take a lot of the pressure off the woman, because she would then be able to go back and get the eggs later and use them in fertility treatment. You'd still need to ask her, of course, and go through the proper procedures for ethical review, but it would certainly make things a lot easier.
If I'm allowed another comment, am I allowed another one? I think the ethics of quantification of loss of fertility in monetary terms is actually quite difficult. If you actually have a donor who is, say, coming off the street and is donating eggs wholly for research, let's take out the fertility issues. There is a small risk that that woman may have a surgical complication, an abscess, and potentially lose her fertility. That's actually very hard, and have a premature menopause, and the quantification of those the compensation is actually quite difficult, yes. I think. And that almost sort of puts it into the unethical regimen.
Well, it would be possible to say that you're not allowed to donate unless you've already had a child or children. Obviously, the best donors with the best eggs are going to be the young girls who haven't started their families.
Yes.
But I think that there are very serious risks in the current state of knowledge in allowing those young people who haven't had children to be donors.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to debate this a little bit, because I think one of the uncertainties of being a human, or one of the things about being human, is the uncertainty of the future. And so anyone who is potentially fertile may in fact meet the man of her dreams next week, who has no children, and she has lost her fertility as a result of research, donating
yes.
for research. That's really a very difficult scenario to deal with.
Yeah.
Any comments
I mean,
on
it
that?
would be met if it was possible for her to store some of her eggs, so that eggs would be there. But, that assumes that the process is good enough to go back and get those eggs later and use them to be fertilised by the new heartthrobs semen. But yes, I think it's very difficult. I think there are strong arguments for limiting donation in those circumstances where women aren't on fertility treatment to older women that have had. I mean, you've still got the possibility that the man might appear later.
It is. It's
Yes,
true. I'd
yeah.
say that, yeah. And I mean, look, the loss of a chance of pregnancy for an infertile woman, if the treatment cycles are unsuccessful and
Yes.
she has donated eggs, it's very hard to quantitate the loss for that person.
Yeah,
and for
and I believe that the scenario that you describe has arisen, where a woman has become, who's not on fertility treatment, has become infertile as a result of being an egg donor. Not in Australia, to my knowledge.
Thanks. I think there's a question down here. Thanks, Ben.
My name's Richard Mures, I'm a GP. I'd like to know, how many eggs are we talking about? I mean, in England, where the research is being undertaken, are there sufficient numbers of eggs to satisfy the research? The other side of that coin is then, what about these women in the infertility that go to the infertility clinics, and there are those spare eggs? Are they going to be sufficient enough to actually provide for the substances that are required for the genomes that are required for the research?
Well, I think the answer is no. I mean, when you think of the Dolly the sheep example I gave you of the number of eggs that were needed there, if we're going to be needing hundreds of eggs, there aren't going to be that number of eggs that are available. I can't tell you about the current situation in England because it's only quite recently that the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority has adopted this policy of allowing women to get the 750 pounds. So if that is going to affect them, they may give more eggs. But they're not going to take all of the eggs that the woman has, even if she was prepared to give all the ones that she's not using for a current pregnancy. And even if they were all taken, you're not going to have hundreds of eggs because the women are only producing a relatively small number of eggs. So it would be unusual for them to get 20. I mean, I defer to one of the ART specialists on this, but it would be unusual to have a large number of eggs, even when the ovaries have been stimulated. The policy now is to put back only one or two eggs at a time. Sorry, I'm talking about embryos now, aren't I? Once the eggs have been fertilised, to only use one or two in the pregnancy. So the other eggs, well, if it was possible to freeze them and keep them, that would resolve that problem. But I don't think we're going to have anything near enough for this sort of research. One of the other things that I didn't talk about, which is possible in England, would be to use eggs from other animals. And this is unlawful in Australia, but rabbits breed like rabbits. So if you were able to get eggs from a rabbit, where they're producing eggs very frequently in large numbers, and you were able to put a human nucleus into those eggs and stimulate it, like a process of somatic cell nuclear transfer, you would have DNA that's almost entirely human, apart from the mitochondrial from the animal. So if it was possible to do this, this would provide you with the source of eggs that you might use in research. Although after a long debate in the House of Lords and the press in England, the law was changed to allow that, none of that research is being done. It just hasn't got funded, even though they got licences to do it. And one reason is because, presumably, because the science is so questionable. Even if you were able to do this, would the information that you get from these cells be able to be extrapolated to humans? So that's not being done.
Any other questions?
It seems to me that the ultimate goal of the research is to allow women who can't have babies to have babies. So if that's the premise, then I just don't see any downside to paying women for their eggs. If everyone wants the same thing, everyone wants these women who can't have babies to fall pregnant. I just don't understand the ethical argument against paying the women to donate their eggs if everybody wants that ultimate goal for infertile women to be able to fall pregnant.
So I obviously haven't put the arguments against as persuasively
Well,
as the
I just don't
arguments
think
for
the arguments
payment.
against are persuasive.
Yes, yeah, well, thank you for that. There will be people who will object. I mean, people will see it as commodification and exploitation of the vulnerable women. There is another argument which I thought you might be going to make as to whether the women are, I mean, this is called the just participant principle, that if you donate for one purpose, then your donated material shouldn't be used in an unrelated area of research. So if you're an infertile woman and you donate your eggs to be used in fertility treatment, it would be ethically improper for those eggs then to be used for stem cell research to treat people with genetic diseases, even if you consented to that. So there is that's another argument against paying women for eggs. But you could meet this by saying the woman could put conditions on the use of the eggs that she donates.
Sorry, just to say, I understand from what you said that it's clearly defined that you can't sell or buy blood or any other body products. Is that correct?
Most people can't. You can't sell your own. You know,
But-
the hospitals sell
Yeah.
and blood banks and things sell tissue, but you can't sell your own.
Would that apply to selling your hair to make wigs? Because
No. And this is a
Okay.
very interesting example because you can see that a different principle applies. And you might say, why should that be the case? You could say that it's dead and that it's therefore different from your bodily material. And you know, of course, it regenerates, but so does blood. I mean, I think there is a literature on that sort of thing. It's an interesting distinction.
With the commodification of human tissue, etc., if the hospitals and blood banks, etc., are allowed to sell your blood, then ethically, why can't the person who originated that commodity benefit from that? I mean, it has always struck me as being really ethically obtuse that if I donate something, that someone else can then go and make money off it. But I can't make money off it.
Yes.
That has always struck me as being very difficult.
Yeah.
And when you look at the prospect of being able to sell your eggs, for a lot of people, you know, if you were getting $10,000 to sell your eggs, like the slide was in New York, that would be a life-changing event for a lot of people.
Yes.
And really, I think the ethics of that should be revisited.
Yeah, well, I said that I wasn't going to talk about giving eggs for treatment, but it's quite common in the United States and you could see the slide that I had up showing that Australians are able to access this through the internet. So American women can sell their eggs for treatment, but we're talking about research, so that's more closely controlled. The legal reason why you can't sell your bodily material is because you don't have proprietary rights in it. So if something is removed from your body, you have no legal rights over it. It's not property. And the reason why other people can later own it is that they do work and skill on it, and they're being paid for the work and skill that has been expended and turned your bodily material into something else, like a cell line. But there's a lot of discussion about this issue at the moment, particularly because of a case in the English Court of Appeal, the case of Yearworth. And in this case, a number of men were going to have chemotherapy for cancer. And before they did that, they went to the sperm bank in the NHS and they put their sperm into the sperm bank with a view to going and getting it later after they'd had the chemo and have a baby, or their partner would have a baby. And the sperm was destroyed negligently by the person who was holding it. And you would think that they would not be entitled to any compensation, because not only can't you sell it, you just don't have any rights in it at all. But the Court of Appeal was obviously sympathetic to their predicament and their loss of fertility. You were talking about how do you price that? Well, people feel very strongly about that. And so the Court of Appeal wanted to give them some sort of remedy. So they said that there had been a bailment. And a bailment is a legal arrangement where you give something to somebody for a short term on the basis that they give it back to you. So I could give you my watch and I'd say, I'm going to give this lecture for an hour. Please hold my watch and I will come back and get it at the end of the lecture. So that's a clear bailment. Now, the reason why you can do that is because my watch is a thing. It's something that I clearly own. I have rights over and I'm entitled to get it back in that arrangement. But you didn't have any rights over your semen, because it's just something that's come from your body that you can't own and have rights over. So when the Court of Appeal said this, you can see that it threw quite a spanner in the works for the theory of owning your body parts and having rights over them. So there are a lot of people doing research on that at the moment.
Would there be a remedy in relation to psychological harm in that case?
There could be an action in negligence. If there was an arrangement where, and this was discussed in the case, if it was admitted that there had been negligence, and you wouldn't have to have a contract. I mean, in this case, you could have a remedy in contract too, but there was no contract because the arrangement was with the NHS, who employed somebody else to hold the sperm. And so I was trying to remember why the negligence action wasn't successful. I'll have to look that up, Mal.
We've got time for just one more question. Over the side.
You alluded to women potentially going through IVF and donating some of their eggs to research, possibly as a mechanism for funding their treatment. The difficulty here is that we're not very good at grading eggs. We're reasonably good at picking which embryos are going to be the ones that go on to implant, and only reasonably, not very good. But we are no good at picking what eggs are going to create those good embryos that will likely to create a pregnancy. So we're unable to help the women retain the ones that are going to give them the pregnancy that they want, while releasing eggs for research.
Thank you for saying that. I should have made that point, because when you think of the woman who she's got the eggs there, and she, particularly if she's tried one or two and they don't work, the other ones are becoming even more precious, because they might be the ones that are better than the ones that have been used first up. So I think that makes it more hard, for the woman in that position. Yes, thank you for that.
Thank you. Folks, it's time to draw the formal part of this evening to a close, and it's my pleasure to give a vote of thanks to Loane. It was a tremendous talk, an informative talk, and an interesting talk, and controversial talk. We are delighted, as Ben said, to have Loane with us tonight to give the first lecture in the public lecture series for the Health Law Research Centre. As Ben said, Loane is really the architect of health law as a discipline in Australia. So we're delighted that you were able to give the talk. And
Thank you.
If you just accept this gift on behalf of the Health Law Research Centre.
My goodness. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anne. And just a vote of thanks to Penny Neller, the Health Law Research Centre Coordinator, and also Pip Trouse. And Dr. Kelly Purser is somewhere in the audience too for organising the event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming as well. And please, I see there's still some food left. We've got the room till 7:30, so please feel free to stay and enjoy. Thanks, folks.